If I were to tell you that there exists a game out there that will offer you an experience that eclipses most open-world single-player games, all whilst also offering you robust online features that surpasses basically all MMOs out there nowadays, with all of this being packaged in a free-to-play live service model that consistently delivers massive content updates with no pay-to-win in sight. I know, you'd be hard-pressed to believe me, but alas, I am not lying. The game I am talking about is called Where Winds Meet, a Chinese wuxia game set in the period so-called 五代十国, aka the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. But more importantly, Where Winds Meet is one of the most ambitious games that I have ever had the pleasure of experiencing, on top of also being one of the first games I've seen make a genuine attempt at trying to revolutionize the MMO genre, primarily in bringing back many of the more social aspects that many MMOs have lost throughout the years. And fortunately for us, the steps Where Winds Meet has taken in trying to achieve this has been quite successful. All of this whilst also being set in a world that is built on centuries of Chinese literary mythology. A world which fantasy the devs want you, the player, to be able to realize and immerse yourself in. And most importantly, a game with the intent to make you quiver at the mere sight of a goose. No, but seriously, why are they built like this? I've seen a lot of people refer to Where Winds Meet as a single-player game with that of a tacked-on MMO component. And yes, it is certainly true that Where Winds Meet can be fully enjoyed as a single-player game, offering you hundreds of hours of content in this mode. Though I still find the notion of the MMO part of the game somehow not being equally of a foundational component as the single-player aspect of the game to be quite the lapse in judgment. Though I can also somewhat see where the confusion might stem from, because it is true that Where Winds Meet isn't an MMO in the traditional sense that we are used to, since that way of designing an MMO have long since reached its expiration date, so to speak. The traditional MMO's strength was that of being able to serve as both a place where you can connect with people, not unlike that of an internet forum in the time before smartphones. A world where logging off from the computer also means severing all connection with your online friends, since there were no social media, or at least no modern day social media. On top of being, well, a game, with activities you can go do with your online friends, whom you back then could only interact with through your computer. So, in a fashion, you could basically consider MMOs back in the day to be that of amusement parks, where you and your online buddies could meet up and do fun activities together. But alas, this was not to, well, last, because, as I have mentioned earlier, in our modern world where we are connected to the online world, if you will, quite literally close to 24/7, that also means that the magic that MMOs have historically been able to offer no longer really serves a purpose, since being able to socialize digitally no longer is the novel thingy that it was back in the day, a thing you could only do so long your computer was turned on. And this is where Winds Meet's approach to tackling the MMO genre comes into play, since the developers behind the game are fully aware of many of the struggles MMOs face in the modern day. Where Winds Meet start off just like almost every traditional MMO, with you being given this crazy in-depth character creator for you to design your character in, be it a character that's an idealized version of yourself, or a character designed to look like what you want to bang the most. And based on how I sound compared to how my character looks, I leave you to figure out which road I took. But it's in after we have made our idealized toon, that we are then thrown into this massive open world for us to explore. Something that we are primarily meant to do alone, though a large portion of this content can also be done with people through co-op. Something that I am fully aware of doesn't really sound all that MMO, right? But let's be real here. In our modern gaming landscape, The traditional MMO actually ends up being played quite similarly nowadays, besides certain forms of multiplayer content, like raids, dungeons and PvP that is. So yes, nowadays most people that play traditional MMOs spend most of their time doing so alone, or with a small group of friends. With the social parts mainly being instanced content that exists outside of the vast open world that once served as a social hub in bygone days. Something that I can personally attest to. Now, whilst I rarely play World of Warcraft nowadays, I do still semi-frequently play Final Fantasy XIV, but in my experience with both games, when it comes to social interaction, you really have to go out of your way to experience it. Most of the time I end up playing solo in these games. And keep in mind, these are the two biggest traditional MMOs on the market by a mile and a half. So in other words, I guess you can say that the Barons aren't the only Baron plays in World of Warcraft anymore. Which now brings us back to Where Winds Meet. So the way Where Winds Meet has decided to go about this is actually quite smart. So what they have ended up doing is quite literally designing a fully fledged high quality solo experience that you can, for the most part, if you so choose, also enjoy in co-op. Which, yes, I know does come across as being counterintuitive to the goal of creating an MMO. But, as I just mentioned, this is just a reality of how people play MMOs nowadays. So, might as well double down on it. But here's also where the developer's unique approach comes into play, which is that they have designed many of the game's systems to incentivize social interaction with other players in quite intuitive ways. This is done both in similar ways to that of what can be found in traditional MMOs nowadays, through the likes of raid encounters and whatnot, but also through other means, where the social aspect serves a greater focus, like, for example, through systems that involve healing other players' injuries, or systems that incentivize you to partake in leisure events with other players, if you so choose. Then there's also whatever this is. With all of these things also rewarding you with in-game rewards. So in other words, I guess you can say that Where Winds Meet has basically turned the social aspects that MMOs had back in the day into another part of the gameplay loop. A gameplay loop which in of itself offers a lot of freedom of choice. And this is on top also bringing certain social components more commonly found in other video game genres into the game as well. Like that of a message that you can leave in the open world to help other people out, akin to what is possible in the Souls games. So whilst one can argue for days about if Where Winds Meet is or isn't an MMO on paper, it's really hard to not argue that it sure as hell is an MMO in practice. One might even say more so than many other, more traditional MMOs nowadays, since Where Winds Meet has managed to find new ways to gain back some of the old charm of being a social hub that MMOs had back in the day. Now, at the same time, the idea of playing Where Winds Meet as a fully fledged single-player experience, one that you can enjoy with no need to interact with close to any of the so-called live service or online components, for lack of a better word, is very much still the case. And it also happens to be one of the things that I truly love about this game, and that being the sheer extent of the autonomy given to you when it comes to how exactly you want to go about enjoying this game. Since in theory you can basically ignore close to the entire MMO component, if you so choose. Instead enjoying the game like how you would any traditional open world single player game, which, I will mention again, is already how a lot of more traditional MMOs are played by large portions of their player bases. I'll also have you know that it isn't an over-exaggeration that you can enjoy this game as a fully-fledged single-player experience, believe me, because this game somehow manages to deliver on the social aspects better than most MMOs out there, but it also delivers a single-player experience that rivals many of the best single-player games out there, when it comes to things like the combat, visuals, music, storytelling, and especially immersion. This accomplishment is something I don't believe the devs have received enough praise for, even when accounting for all the praise they've already received, which is already a lot, I'll have you know. And to be honest, I don't find this surprising at all. I mean, it offers such a vast yet deep array of content for you to enjoy, with which parts you choose to engage with, basically being up to you and you alone. I personally think this is a game dev achievement that is deserving of being celebrated, and I'm happy that seems to be the case. Though there is also one other thing I want to mention that the devs have delivered exceptionally well on. Something that probably won't get as much praise by the quote-unquote Western community as it probably should. With what I'm referring to, of course, being the fantasy of playing in a living, breathing, wuxia-inspired world. And to now quickly explain what wuxia is. In short, it's basically a form of Chinese fantasy that also tries to be grounded to a certain extent in reality, in the sense that most fantastical elements, for the most part, draw their inspiration from real-life ideas or concepts. Keyword being draw their inspiration. It can get quite wacky sometimes. Think of it as basically being Chinese low fantasy. Kinda, but not really, but also, it's complicated. But yeah, and just like with any genre of fantasy, there's going to be a lot of people that have long been dreaming about being able to immerse themselves in a world akin to said genre, and wuxia is, of course, no exception to this. Many people have for a long time dreamt of a game that offers an immersive wuxia experience in the form of a video game, something that, to my knowledge, up until now hasn't really been attempted before, at least not to such a degree that can be found in Where Winds Meet. And the devs' hard work in bringing this part of the game to life has actually also had a positive and most likely intended side effect of also contributing massively to many of the game's social systems that can be found in the game, due to many of them being staples in the wuxia genre. This is actually taken a step further when you account for the fact that Where Winds Meet is set in a fictional version of a real-life Chinese time period, something that is to a certain degree also represented through many of the game's systems. As an example, take the game's absurd amount of currencies. Yes, whilst partially a gameplay feature, it's unironically also a big point within the world and story itself, one that mirrors the real-life equivalent of the time period, where there also happen to be a lot of different currencies because of reasons. Yeah, let's go with that. So all in all, to give a quick summary, Where Winds Meet has managed to turn what would normally be considered a negative into that of a boon instead, by managing to make both the single-player and multiplayer components of the game complement each other instead of clash, all whilst still allowing you to only interact with one of them, if that's what you would prefer, which has had the end result of giving players a lot of freedom in how they decide to approach the game. Now, time for the monetization talk. So, Where Winds Meet has surprisingly good monetization, for what is basically a free-to-play gacha game. With some caveats, of course. But compared to what optics might insinuate, yeah, the monetization is quite inoffensive. And that's mainly because there's no pay-to-win in sight, meaning you can quite literally ignore the entire system if you so choose. Sure, there's a horse that can automatically pick flowers, but last time I checked, that horse isn't named Clip-Clop, so checkmate nerds. But jokes aside, the furthest the monetization ever goes is some very minor pay for convenience, with emphasis on the minor. So yeah, 90% of the monetization in Where Winds Meet is purely cosmetic, which is something that I hope more games start to do, instead of, pay for power bullshit. Since when the only thing that's locked behind real-life currencies are cosmetics, well, that means you don't have to actually interact with the system if you so choose. Though, I guess the downside, like it is in the case of Where Winds Meet, is that the cosmetics can get quite pricey. No, scrap that. Can get really pricey. Like, really, really pricey. And this is obviously not to say that there aren't cheaper alternatives as well, because there are. Quite a lot of them, in fact. The game actually even has a 10% discount coupon that can be stacked up to 5 times, meaning every few months, you have the ability to slash the price of almost any outfit you desire by 50%, with the only cosmetics that this isn't possible for being those tied to the gacha. And speaking of the gacha, it's not the most free-to-play friendly gacha to have ever existed, to say the least, though on the other side it also isn't as bad as it might look, since the way it's been designed means that you're eventually bound to hit big, so to speak. Might just take a while for the F2B players to get there. But as for the best part about the monetization, it's that we know, thanks to the game having been out in China for about a year now, that the devs' promise to keep the game free from pay-to-power features has remained true. And considering the game's massive success, keeping it that way certainly seems like the best option, which is of course to great benefit to us, the players. So to now wrap up this video, Revolutionized is a game I hope succeeds, since if it does, there's going to be a stronger likelihood that the future of the MMO genre isn't entirely cooked, due to the incessant amount of pay-to-win that can be found in many of these games. As for the other important lesson, Revolutionized showcases that the social systems many MMOs nowadays are quite void of can still find ways to continue to exist, albeit of course in slightly different forms from back in the day. Which means that said part of the MMO genre needn't die out like many have feared. But yeah, I think that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, might I encourage you to maybe check out any of my other videos, since that would be very kind of you. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you back here for my next video as well. Take care.